just want to jump right into our presenting well with our speakers, Mimi Bernal-Graves and Eileen Collins-Turvey, both from TriMet. Thank you all so much for this important topic, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much, Kammy.
I am going to share our slide deck. Eileen.
Thanks, Mimi. Welcome, everyone, to Presenting Well. Mimi and I are really happy to be here with you today. The slides in this presentation deck will use consistent TriMet brand colors, blue and orange, with the TriMet rosette logo throughout. And if there are graphics or icons on the slide, we will describe them as we move through the presentation today. We opened our presentation with an image on screen that represents a large community along a transit center platform. There is also a QR code on this slide that you can scan with your phone camera for copies of the presentation materials, and we will display this code at the end of the presentation as well. And we want to note that while we do have the chat feature turned on, that if folks are using screen readers to access the content, the chat will play to them through their screen reader. So if you have questions, please pose them through the Q&A option on the bottom of your screen, just between resources and show captions, and that will get the questions to the moderator to be asked and answered later. And we explain some of these things about the colors that we're using and the icons that we, or the images on our screen, because this is one of the tenets of Presenting Well, that we want to describe every bit of the content that we have here. So as we move forward, we're going to take a slight step back and tell you who we are. So my name is Eileen Collins-Turvey. I'm the Director of Accessible Transportation Programs for TriMet in Portland, Oregon. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a middle-aged white woman with shoulder-length brown hair, and I love big, chunky, funky glasses. I am a certified ADA coordinator with a master's degree in public administration, and most importantly to me, I am the mother of a child on the autism spectrum. So my lived experience with my hidden disability, as well as my son's, really informs my passion for the work I'm privileged to do every day in the community that I get to serve. I should also add, I am the executive advisor for TriMet's Disability Awareness Employee Engagement Group, TriMetable, which I started with this amazing woman, Mimi.
Thank you, Eileen. My name is Mimi Bernal-Graves, and I'm a middle-aged woman who has purple, blue, and green hair. My pronouns are she, they. I am a fan of retro style glasses, bold colors, anything sparkly, and giant earrings. I chair our TriMet Able Employee Engagement Group with Justin Rossman. So he works with Eileen and I on that. And I'm a proud member of our disability community. I am our learning management system program manager at TriMet. I'm an adjunct instructor with the College of Education at Portland State University, and I also sit on the board of a public health-oriented organization.
Awesome, thanks, Mimi. Today, as we get into our presentation agenda, it will consist of 4 parts. The first is an overview of universal design as a framework. Secondly, we'll go into preparation and planning for accessible community engagement. Then we'll talk a little bit about best practices for accessible presentations, and then we'll finish up with universal communication tools for public audiences.
So we on this slide are representing a journey with a start point and an end point and a road connecting the two. We hope the journey today, by the end of this presentation, with our toolkit, we don't expect anybody to memorize any of this. In fact, Eileen and I don't memorize this either. So with the toolkit and resources we're going to share, you'll be able to apply the 7 principles of universal design. Is there a question? No. Okay. Indicate how participants interested in the presentation can request accommodations in advance. Proactively apply design best practices when you're building and creating presentation materials. I will say, when we say presentation here, we're not just talking about a slide deck presentation. A presentation could be sharing a dashboard report. It could be an infographic. It could be a newsletter. Anything that you're presenting to a large audience who have a broad range of characteristics, and emphasizing the individual as the primary focus when developing and delivering a presentation.
So we want to talk a little bit about why this matters. Would it surprise you to know that according to the Centers for Disease Control, about 26% of adults in the US have a disability? These statistics are being displayed on the slide over a map of the United States. Additionally, for our transit audience members here, 33% of transit riders identify as being a person with a disability. That's 1 out of every 3 riders. That means at best, at least 1 out of 4 of us in this virtual room today, or in every audience we present to, in every circle we socialize in, experience some level of disability that may impact how we process and receive information. The truth is that disability and accessibility challenges impact all of us or someone we know and love. And for people who experience disabilities, access is key to effective community engagement. We're going to take you into an exercise that sort of prompted the birth of this presentation and this class that we've developed at TriMet. A common experience when presenting information to members of our Committee on Accessible Transportation, specifically around service changes, would be to point and describe what's on the screen. Maybe it's using your mouse, or if you're in an in-person presentation, maybe you have a laser pointer. And we would have presenters who would say things like, we're going to move this line, or we're going to bifurcate this line. We're going to go from right here to over there. And down here, we're going to have this change happening, but over there, no change will occur, which is a challenge if you're trying to effectively communicate information. If I explained it to you that way, would you know what changes are happening with our service change? Most often when we provide this presentation, the answer is a resounding no. So do you know where to go and where the service change is happening so you can confidently navigate the transit system after this explanation? This can be a regular experience for members of our community engaging with our transit systems. I'd like to share an actual impact of a service change on one of our Committee on Accessible Transportation members. This person waited for 2 hours for their bus, which wasn't going to come because we removed the stop they historically used. And we provided a static JPEG image of the map on our website, noting the service changes. And we had a sandwich board, an A board with a printed sign on it, telling people that that stop was no longer in service. However, for a person who's blind or with limited vision, they couldn't see that sign. So it wasn't until the bus operator who saw her the first time they went through that stop and then continued their entire route, came back the second time 2 hours later and said, excuse me, can I help you? And she said, I'm waiting for the bus 12. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, the bus 12 doesn't stop here anymore. There's a sign right next to you that says the stop has been moved. But she had to wait for a sighted person to tell her where to go because we built barriers in how we communicated. And I wish I could say that was an isolated incident, but it's not. So we've been doing a lot of work at TriMet and working with community partners to identify better ways to make accessible maps. And that's a map that can be used by everyone. It has several key features, including some of the following components. It has good labels. Map controls are clearly labeled and can be operated without a mouse, which means we'll get into some semantic markup about using headings appropriately so that screen readers can read the content. Color alone is not used, is used to convey meaning. So maybe it's dashed lines, maybe it's hash marks, but color alone is not used. Text descriptions and content lines are easy to read and understand, which means the text is large enough to read. It means that the text is in a font that can be legibly read if people can see it visually. There's a non-graphical form, meaning that there's text backup and content to support that. They're simple. They're kept consistent and simple in their styling. Maybe you don't put 5 different service changes on one map, but break them up geographically so that you can isolate each change for each route on an individual map to make it simpler for people to perceive. There is hopefully a tactile version as well. A tactile or braille map may be available for non-sighted users. And then you use data tables or additional text to add value to the map. Have a legend that defines what the colors or symbols mean. And we'll get into more about semantic markup, but it refers to marking up a document with information about the actual data structure behind the information, rather than just styling the document exclusively with visual information. For example, if you think about Microsoft Word, there are options for headings. Heading 1 may be a 16-point font and bold, but that heading has significant information in its programming to tell a screen reader that you can go from heading to find information. It's not simply just making a larger font. So we want people to understand how to use their tools. And all of these components are things that we will dig into today. This is a really key quote for us because we recognize that if we use the opportunity of design to empower everyone, which Dan Formosa from Smart Design is quoted as saying, we can make everything more accessible to the broad community that we serve. Displaying on this slide is an icon of a group of people sitting in a circle formation with the question, how can you present your material effectively to a public audience or large group, respond to requests for specific accommodations, and ensure that everyone feels welcome? If it is your goal to be as welcoming as possible, then the principles of universal design will be a guiding force in your future presentations, and you will be a better steward of effectively communicating with any audience you are engaging with. And now an icon with a small group of people surrounded by a circle and a heart is displayed on this slide. Throughout this presentation, we will be sharing best practices based on universal design. There are other resources with additional information, such as a book, a great book called All Aboard, Conducting Accessible Community Involvement for Public Transit by Ron Brooks, Kristen Joyner, Mary Liz McNamara, and Michelle Whitman. It's available on Amazon, and not that we're biased, but we are quoted in this book as having some best practices around this topic. So we encourage folks to take a look at that and find a deeper dive about many of these topics. Because universal design is not just about designing presentations or designing transit centers. It's a proactive approach to making facilities, information, presentations, and instruction welcoming and accessible to everyone. Universal design means that rather than designing something for the quote unquote average user, you design it for people with a broad range of characteristics. When you design for a wide array of needs, you make the item you are designing more accessible to everyone. To apply universal design to your presentations, it's important that you know how to present your material effectively to people with a variety of abilities and respond to requests for specific accommodations. Universal design as a framework is represented by an icon of a hand holding a globe on this slide. Ensuring everyone feels welcome can get to the virtual or physical location of the presentation and maneuver within it, access the presentation's electronic and printed content, and fully participate in activities is a goal which involves efforts and understanding at many levels. We're going to briefly review the principles of universal design, as we will spend most of this presentation demonstrating these principles through examples and discussion. We just want to note, this is typically a 3-hour class that we deliver, so we've consolidated much of the information into this 35-minute presentation, but the resource guide that you have in the toolkit will provide much more elaborate detail. So principle 1 is equitable use. It means that the design considers people with varied abilities. For example, building a ramp instead of stairs. Those benefit families with strollers and bicyclists, as well as people who use mobility devices. Principle 2 is flexibility in use. The design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. For instance, planning your event so that it is easily accessible on the first floor of a venue, and planning remove as many barriers as you can. It also means maybe removing seats, chairs from seats in a conference plan so that people who use mobility devices know that they've been thought of in how you lay out your room. Principle 3 is simple and intuitive. Use of the design is easy to understand. Principle 4 is perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively. Consider using, for example, Braille in addition to printed information on signs and instructional tools. Principle 5 is tolerance for error. The design minimizes adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. For example, how we have tactile domes on the edge of our rail platforms to warn people who are blind or have low vision that there is danger ahead. Principle 6, low physical effort. The design can be used with little fatigue. And principle 7 is size and space for approach and use. means that appropriate size and space is provided for different body sizes, posture, or mobility. For example, designing a bus stop platform that is large enough for a ramp to be deployed from the bus and also allow a rider using a mobility scooter to exit on the ramp and turn to the sidewalk without running into a tree or power pole.
Thank you, Eileen, for all that great information. We're going to hop into some of the things that you can do preparation and planning proactively to set up templates or kind of scrub some of your materials so that they are at a universal design level. I just want to say that I know we have packed a lot into this short time, and I just wanted to highlight what Eileen said about our toolkit. We have a bunch of resources in there. I do want to say that the resources provided in our presentation and toolkit are for reference purposes only. TriMet doesn't create, maintain, or endorse the content within these resources, and you are encouraged to review and use them at your discretion in accordance with your own company and agency guidelines and policies around, technology and stuff like that. So with that, let's hop in. The first line on this slide, we're going to talk about balancing presentation goals with audience needs. So the first line on this slide displays a magnifying glass over a page with words to represent using an easy to read font, making text and important visuals big enough to be read even from the back of the room. This includes graphics, videos, posters, and other non-electronic material as well. The second line shows an icon of a person who is anxious and stressed out to represent the importance of using animations, motion, and sound judiciously. Consider how to use motion or animations and if they're really necessary. This includes text or images flying in from the side. Will motion make the information easier to understand, or is it unnecessary? Certain types of motion can be particularly distracting for some people, and it can actually make some people ill. The last line shows a person with an internet symbol and document pages around them to represent proactively making materials available in different formats in consideration of accessibility needs. So today we had the QR code for people to pull it up. Mpact has graciously uploaded resources to the resources area in this presentation, and we are speaking it aloud, and we have visuals to go with it. So those are just some of the ways that we've made the information available today in multiple formats for everybody. Alt text or alternative text is a big deal. If you take nothing away but this, that would be amazing. Although we really hope you take away more than this. But alternative text or alt text is descriptive text, which conveys context for a visual item in a digital setting. On this slide, the Microsoft Office alt text instruction window, along with a photograph showing an image of a teacher and a student reading a book using the Braille system with their hands, is displayed on this slide. When screen readers, such as JOBS Access with Speech, or JAWS, and Non-Visual Desktop Access, or NVDA, read digital content, the alt text is read aloud, helping individuals understand what is on the screen. Well-written, descriptive alt text will dramatically reduce ambiguity and improve the audience experience for those with low or no vision. Also, screen readers are used by folks who have cognitive processing differences and folks who maybe have had a brain injury, so it can help them understand the material. Alt text shouldn't be longer than a sentence or two. Really consider what's important when describing visuals. Is it the setting, the emotions, people's faces, colors, the relative size of objects, etc. There's an extensive resource section on alt text in our toolkit because, again, this is Microsoft Word. Every program has its own way that you insert alternative text for graphical items. So when we talk about designing, one of the things that's really important to know, like Eileen said earlier, just going to echo that, do not rely on color alone. On this slide, we're displaying 4 different variations of color vision. So you have full color vision, which is represented by the bar at the top. showing different colors. Red or green color vision, this is the most common type of what people refer to as color blindness. It has 4 subtypes. Blue-yellow color vision has 2 subtypes, and then there are folks who have monochromacy, which is grayscale, so they see things in black and white and grayscale. So I would like to call your attention to the red-green color vision. So if you think you've got this thing that really stands out in bright green, and you're like, this is amazing, everybody's going to see this, it's going to be great, and somebody has red-green color vision, it might actually be beige to them on a white background, which is really not going to help anything stand out. So when we talk about color vision, it's important to keep this in mind. It does affect a large part of our population. And so some of the ways that you can get around this are contrast ratios and some other tools that we have coming up. This is just one more example of why it's important to not depend on color alone to draw attention to information. Sometimes when you go somewhere, you show your slides, you print your materials, and that slide, the projector, maybe it doesn't show green well, or when you print it, maybe the printer's out of ink or something like that. And so what you think it's going to look like, it doesn't. So just on here, we're showing a bunch of words in their respective colors, brown, blue, gray, red, or black, on a green background. And that is really difficult to decipher those words. Also, if you use gray or purple with blue, that can be really difficult to see as well. So when you're looking at this, also imagine this previous slide. The blue and red can look very differently to folks who have color blindness. So contrast, this is your secret weapon for not relying on color. As we noted on previous slides, it's important to use sufficient contrast between colors, and it's called luminescence contrast. Everybody just calls it a contrast ratio. It's a differentiation between text and images in the foreground and what is in the background. Contrast also comes into consideration for graphs, tables, images, charts, things like that. And this can feel like a lot to know. There are tons of resources available to us. And again, I don't have this memorized, and neither does Eileen. And technology and information's change over time too. So there are free contrast ratio calculators where you can actually go plug in the colors you're using and make sure that there's sufficient contrast. I will say on this slide that the best contrast ratio is 8:1. That is like what we would strive for. If we're not able to do that, 4:1 is the bare minimum for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. The link to those are in your toolkit. Those are an international best practice for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So on this slide, the contrast ratio with the dark navy blue background and the white lettering on top shows up the very best. And if it's a light blue or a light gray background with white text at the bottom with that basically 1:1 contrast ratio, it's really difficult to read that. People do use shading and outlines to help with contrast, but use those sparingly. If you have a whole document or something all in outline or all shaded, it gets a little bit intense. So just know that. On this slide too, we're displaying a person who's laying a foundation. And these are just foundational pieces of information that we're going to give you in your toolbox that you can pull out and leverage when you're building templates or building presentation or any form of communication that's going to go to a wide audience. So let's talk about font basics. We want to use 14 or bigger font for handouts or things that you're going to print and give to people. Just note that the American Association for the Blind, their recommendation is 18-point font. And for slides, we want to use 24 font or bigger. There's one exception for this, and only one. If you work in a legal environment and for compliance reasons, you have to have a rule or a clause or something all displayed in full and it's tiny, that is sometimes we can't get around, compliance or legal reasons why we have to do things. In that instance, what a recommendation would be to say, I understand this is really small. We want to make sure we have all the information for you, and either hand out a larger version of it so people have the option to take a look at that, or if you're sending it out electronically, maybe make sure people have that before your presentation so that they can understand what you're going through. Don't use small font size. It's really hard to read. So please, if you have one slide that's really packed full, break it up. Use bold and underline sparingly. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, and people are going to get overwhelmed by it and they're going to just shut down. Please don't use italics. If you can help it, they can be hard to read for folks. If you think about somebody who has dyslexia or maybe English isn't their first language, italics can make things a little bit more difficult for folks to read. I do understand sometimes we have to use italics, so just use that sparingly if you have to use it at all. Really want to use an easy to read font like Arial or Tahoma. Here at TriMet, we have a custom font for one of our marketing fonts, and it doesn't always show up on people's computers. So it's a kind of a custom one that you have to download. So if I know I'm creating something for a larger audience, I will use our other approved font, which is Source Sans Pro, because I know that that would be on any electronic device that anybody would pull up. It would show on Google Docs well. So keep those things in mind. And don't use hard to read font like the super flowery Edwardian script. And I mean, it looks so beautiful, but my goodness, it's very difficult to read. Also, justification matters. For those who may not be familiar, we've talked about a screen reader. And what a screen reader does for folks who are non-sighted is it literally goes through what's on screen, depending how that has been programmed by the person designing it. And it reads everything out loud. So in the United States, we read top to bottom, left to right. Some cultures read bottom to top, right to left. So know where you're giving your presentation. If you've done something amazing and you're doing an international presentation and it's, a different way that they orient, just know that so that you can get your information across. For us today, we are in the United States, and I'm going to focus on what justification would need to be here. So left justified is easier. We adults love patterns, and we are introduced to left justification very early on with books and all kinds of things. So we love it, and if we can, we want to use that. Please don't use centering or right justification excessively. I understand that sometimes we do have to use those justifications, but a screen reader, if you have something centered or right justified, depending again on what software you're using, it can, the screen reader could miss, reading a line or maybe not seeing it accurately, and it kind of gets garbled for folks. And then this is why I say, please don't use justified. We just use this all the time because we've always done it. Especially with legal documents, which is the most important kind of document for somebody to actually understand. So question this in your world if people are justifying things. Again, for people who have dyslexia, English isn't their first language. They're using screen readers. These different spaces can make this very interesting experience for people to navigate. So please don't ever use justified text for paragraphs. And I am going to hand it back to you, Eileen.
Thanks, Mimi. Now that we've gone through some of the technical components, we're going to go through some of the soft skills about accessible presentations. Warmly welcoming participants is represented by a smiley face icon on this slide. Demonstrating accessibility as a priority can be achieved in a number of ways. First, promoting your presentation with organizations and affiliated groups who represent an array of interests, abilities, and needs. Provide opportunities for attendees to request accommodations in advance and build your network of providers who can serve those needs. It's always easier for folks to one-on-one ask for an accommodation than having to announce what their disability might be in front of a whole room of people and then asking for accommodation. So just be mindful of that, which is why our second point is to greet participants as they enter the room, make eye contact with each person if that's comfortable for you, and then potentially be able to assess if they need an accommodation at that point. Be respectful of your audience. They bring varied life experiences, education, and professional expertise. Ask if there are any accommodations needed again, and identify yourself. And if you feel comfortable, provide a visual description of yourself as we did during our introduction. We find that 93% of communication is nonverbal. And when you can't see the nonverbal communication, you are just left with that 7% of communication that is verbal. So the more that we can make a connection to our audience, parlaying that, maybe they like big chunky glasses as well. So now they feel a connection to us as a human being. So we find that that's a really helpful tool. And then utilize the accessibility features of the technology you're using. If you're doing it on a virtual platform, maybe share with folks what kind of technology enhancements and accessibility features are available on the differences between Zoom and Teams and WebEx and all of the different platforms that folks may not be familiar with. Then we want to promote a welcoming and non-judgmental environment from the start. On this slide, an icon of a person thinking about planning is displayed. We want to plan activities to accommodate any individuals with limited mobility if applicable. Sometimes there are activities in conferences or sessions where we ask people to all stand with me and let's do a stretch break. But if you are a person who's in a mobility device and you can't stand, now you feel excluded from participation. So instead of saying that, say something like, if you're willing and able, please stand with me, or maybe plan an activity that might be more accessible for everyone. Then manage expectations by letting participants know if you will field questions during or after your presentation. For folks who may have cognitive challenges or memory issues, they may not remember their question for later. So if they know that questions will all be handled at the end of the presentation, it gives them an opportunity to maybe write it down and then have it for later. Repeat questions and comments from the audience aloud so everyone in the room can benefit from the information. We will get into voice modulation and projecting later, but sometimes you get a question from someone in the first row that the panel hears very clearly, but people in the back of the room don't. So they get the benefit of your answer if you have a microphone, but they don't know the context because they can't hear the question. And then we really want to underscore the need to provide wait time or pauses for participants to process information prior to answering. So if you ask immediately if anyone has questions and within 10 seconds, no one raises a hand, it's okay to be comfortable with silence for a moment and let people process and have time to come up with a good question. And then summarize your key points. We want to redirect discussion that wanders from the topic at hand so you stay focused. And we do that by having what we call a parking lot. And we tell people if their topic is not related to the presentation point directly, let's put that in the parking lot and get back to it later if we have time. Now we want to talk about some ways we can communicate respectfully with and about an individual who has a disability. And we can do that by emphasizing the person as the primary focus, not the disability. We represent this concept with a pair of hands holding a group of people on this slide. For example, when referring to a person with a disability, use phrases such as a person who, a person with, or a person who has. For example, instead of a wheelchair user, try saying a person who uses a mobility device. Instead of a blind rider, try saying a person with a visual impairment. Instead of an autistic person, try a person who's on the autism spectrum or a person who is neurodiverse. And this is a newer one for us, but because income status and low income status particularly often accompanies people who are experiencing disability, because 80% of people with disabilities are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed than the general public. The term a low income rider can often come with unintended consequences. So we like to say a person who qualifies for fair assistance. People with disabilities have different preferences on which language they use and prefer. Just ask. Additionally, we want to avoid outdated terms like handicapped, crippled, or other hurtful words. We also want to stay away from statements like a person who suffers from epilepsy, a person who suffers from Alzheimer's. We don't know if they suffer, and it adds a value-laden judgment there, and so we just want to stay away from that. At the end of it all, don't make assumptions. An icon of two hands arranged in a heart shape is shown on this slide. There are so many opportunities in presentations to use universal design and language proactively to ensure presentations are accessible to all in our audiences. While accommodations will likely always be necessary in some capacity, being selective of the language you use lessens the burden of constantly needing to advocate for access needs. Here are some examples. As we mentioned, the statement, "I need everybody to stand now." Try saying something like, "If you're able and willing, please stand with me." Often we hear, and hopefully you did not hear it today, but we say a lot on virtual presentations, "Can everybody see my screen?" Well, if you have people who are either on the phone and so they don't have a video showing, or if they're blind or low vision, they can't see your screen. So try saying something like Mimi did earlier, "I'm now sharing content on screen. Can I get a confirmation that my presentation is now appearing?" And often in transit, whether it's an automated stop announcement on your bus or something that your on-street customer support might say to a customer, we say things like, "As you walk down the street, you will see landmark X on your right." However, we want to change the narrative on that and say, "As you move down the street, there will be landmark X on your right." It may sound like semantics to some. And I want you to hear this loud and clear because this was the genesis for this training. When we exclude the lived experience of people who move differently through the world in our language or process information differently in our language, there is often an assumption that we have not considered their needs from our planning and implementation efforts. It's where we really underscore that representation matters. So we may say, "As you walk or roll." And when people who use a mobility device hear you say, "As you walk or roll down the street," they then think, wow, they've really thought about how I will use this information, how I will use this service. And then they're less likely to be defensive about the information you're presenting. But if they feel like you've excluded them from your planning, they're going to come back with you with probably more defensive questions than if you would have included them in your language to start. Let's talk a little bit about what to avoid in accessible presentations. We want to avoid the use of complex charts, infographics, and diagrams. Instead, use simple graphics with limited data and describe all visuals in your presentation. Now, this slide has an icon representing a simple bar chart as a visual aid. We want to define the access labels of your charts and the values represented. Remember, there's a fourth grade reading level rule and comprehension at play here. Material written at the 4th to 6th grade level is considered easy to read. 7th to 9th grade materials are considered to be of average difficulty, and anything written at the 10th grade level or above is considered difficult to read and comprehend. In the US, the average reading level is about 4th grade. We also want to remember that people learn differently. Not all learners absorb content visually. Some learn by hearing, some learn by doing. Just remember that 2/3 of your audience likely learns differently than you, so plan accordingly. And then we want to save complicated content for a supplemental handout. Verbally describe all of the content being displayed. If it's not important enough to describe, it is likely unnecessary for the presentation. If you are showing a video, consider utilizing closed captioning with video content. You want to give a brief description of the video before it is played as well. Pro tip here though, not all videos have closed captioning, and many have closed captioning that is not 100% accurate. Be sure to review the closed caption options before your presentation and adjust or correct as necessary. And then again, use clear descriptive alt text for tables, photos, and graphics. Now this slide displays an icon of a microphone to emphasize the importance of speech volume and modulation. Remember, even if you think your voice is loud enough, and I hear it every time I go to a conference, there's always someone who says, "Oh, everybody can hear me." And the tendency is to really speak up and project when you say that. But as you get further into your conversation or further into your presentation, your voice will eventually fade back to a normal speaking tone, and then people can't hear you. So it's always a best practice to use a microphone. When a participant is deaf, or is hard of hearing, comes to the session, you want to check in with them regarding any accommodation needs, such as lighting and seating preference. However, not all disabilities are obvious, and indeed, many are non-apparent. You may need to reserve seats in the front of the room for priority seating, just as we do on our buses. If you are speaking to a person who is deaf or has a language translator, speak directly to the individual, not their interpreter, and avoid standing between the interpreter and the participant. Always face the audience. Don't turn your back to look at the slide deck on screen while speaking. Your voice projects in the direction that you are facing. Speak slowly and clearly. Face the audience while speaking, and do not block the screen. Speak in a well-modulated tone. Avoid speaking too rapidly or softly. This is particularly important for individuals who may process language differently than you, people with hearing impairments, and when sign language interpreters, or CART, which is Communication Access Real-Time Translation, transcribers are in the room. We also want to address accessibility issues for activities such as small group discussions. On this slide is an icon of two people having a conversation. People learn differently, as we've discussed a few minutes ago, so we need to present instructions in all the ways adults learn. We want to verbally explain directions for activities, as well as posting instructions on the presentation slide deck or any handouts. How many times have you heard people say, once they get in their small groups, wait, now what are we supposed to be doing? This tip helps to solve for that. We want to provide handouts and then provide an example of the activity to ensure understanding. Mimi?
Thanks, Eileen. So we're going to take it home with section 4 here and talk a little bit about communicating and applying these principles. So people with disabilities are human. Acknowledge our differences just as you would acknowledge anyone else's uniqueness, and just treat us like you would treat anybody else. Don't talk down to us literally or figuratively. As the icon on this slide demonstrates, if a person uses a mobility device, use a chair or kneel to be eye level with the person if you're having a long conversation. Don't make decisions for folks. An example of this is somebody is in a mobility device, you can walk up and just start pushing it or moving the mobility device around. That's really unacceptable to do. Don't tell folks with disabilities what to do or use baby talk, and speak directly to the person, not to the companion interpreter. And here's a spoiler alert. If you speak louder and you're still using ways to communicate that people can't process, it's not going to help them understand the information more. So you don't have to raise your volume of your voice when you're having some of these conversations. And if the option the person chooses, if you've gone over, what the choices are, and it seems like maybe that's a little bit difficult, please let them make that choice and don't qualify it with, are you sure? Are you sure? Do you need help? Are you sure? Because that gets a little bit demeaning. We want to observe attentively when you're talking with a person who has difficulty speaking. So this could be somebody with English as a second language. This could be somebody with a speech impediment. This could be somebody with a disability. It could be somebody who needs a little bit more time to articulate words for whatever reason. So be patient and know that a lack of immediate response does not indicate that the person can't or won't respond. The graphic on this slide represents a person sitting and speaking with another person who has a prosthetic leg. When we're trying to understand things, and if I was speaking to somebody I don't understand, I might lean in, I might furrow my brow, I might cross my arms because I'm really thinking about it. Just be aware if that person, is watching you have those body language kind of subconscious reactions to the conversation. It can be a little bit disconcerting to try to explain something to somebody who's really leaning in and looking at you. So just be mindful of your body language. Be patient, wait for the person to finish, and don't pretend to understand if you can't. Feel free to ask clarifying questions like, what I'm understanding, Eileen, that you've told me is ... And Eileen can either say yes, Mimi, or no, Mimi, and then further clarify with me. If you're unsure of how you should interact with a person, just ask them. So we actually had this feedback in our employee engagement group that folks really wanted to sign up to volunteer to provide ride guide assistance and on-street customer service, but they had not done so because they were worried that they might upset somebody with, a cane, somebody who's unsighted. They just didn't know how to approach people. So they're like, I'm just not going to do it at all. So first off, don't assume people need assistance. We are in this world. We've been in this world our whole lives. We're pretty good at navigating. If they want help, you can ask, hey, would you like help with that? If they say no, respect that choice. If somebody is struggling, on this slide, there's two people having a conversation while they're carrying a box together. If it looks like somebody's struggling, still respect their choice. However, if there's a safety situation that's going to happen, intervene just as you would with anybody else in that situation. This slide displays a group of people, and one is in a dashed outline to represent invisible disabilities. For example, you can give really simple verbal directions to someone, and you're like, that's so easy. But really for them, it's not easy. They can't retain information, or they know they need to refer to something later. So perhaps you can offer to write something down, or they ask you to write it down. And just respect that choice. They're asking for a reason, and it's not their job to explain why they need it that way. And people who have psychiatric disabilities can have varying personalities and different way of coping with their disability. They can have trouble picking up on social cues, be really sensitive. So just treat each people's individuals and make sure you give grace. Ask what will help people be comfortable, respect their needs to the maximum extent possible. And it's important to know folks living with disabilities encounter unique stressors in daily life. On this slide, there's a group of people, one using a cane, one who's blind, and one who's speaking to them at a transit stop. If an individual has to navigate a new situation or deal with an unanticipated change, it can be very stressful. So if there is a service change that you need to communicate and people are getting a little defensive or a little upset, it's very difficult sometimes to navigate their daily environment, and have a change introduced makes it a lot for them. Just note too, disability simulation experiences should be done for design and navigational purposes only. It's considered offensive to pretend to have a disability. And Eileen?
You did. Thanks, Mimi. So why does all of this matter? I saw a question in the Q&A about how our TriMet's Committee on Accessible Transportation has responded to this. So I will definitely cover that in this slide. Because accessible and universal content design and community engagement is crucial for creating a world where everyone can access the same information and opportunities and be served by the programs and services we offer as a public agency. Again, I staff TriMet's Committee on Accessible Transportation, and we often have presenters, internal and external, who come to our members seeking their input as older adults and people with an array of lived experience with disability, who are appointed by our board of directors and our general manager to advise TriMet staff on accessibility issues. Except the content they present is in formats, colors, and with expectations that cannot be met by the technical, physical, or functional needs of and abilities of the members. Therefore, the valuable and insightful feedback that could have been offered is now a lost opportunity, which means that an entire community is being excluded from meaningful engagement and participation. And again, this is 33% of our transit riders. So when I say it like that, it sounds preposterous that we would knowingly present information that way, right? And since we have been teaching this class at TriMet for the past 3 years, we have seen a complete 180 in the way that our committee engages more positively, in a more engaged way with our staff. And we're building one of the most accessible systems in the country because I think we're doing it in a more meaningful and intentional way. And we hear from them at meeting. We meet the third Wednesday of every month, and consistently their feedback to presenters is, oh my goodness, this is the best presentation I've ever seen. I actually understand how that new bus rapid transit line on TV Highway is actually going to impact me. Thank you so much. So by taking the steps laid out in this presentation and in our toolkit, you also can maximize your agency's reach and impact and build a path forward to effectively engaging all of the members of our communities. Mimi, do you have some final thoughts?
Absolutely. So I want to say constantly having to advocate for your space in the world is exhausting. So if all of us just do a little bit of planning, a little bit of proactive approach, use a little bit of universal design, we can support our whole communities without them having to constantly remind us to think of them. And I think that that's really powerful. I apologize, we might not be able to get to all questions in the time we have left, but our contact information is here on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time.